In Lagos, some weddings are remembered for their glamour. This one would be remembered for its ruin. From the moment the sun rose over Victoria Island that Saturday morning, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. In a place where wealth often dressed itself in noise, convoys blaring horns, politicians flooding the streets with banners, socialites dripping in sequins under neon lights, this day's silence carried more weight than 1,000 sirens. It was the day of the Adedayo wedding, and even the restless waves of the Atlantic seemed to pause against the shore as if in deference. Newspapers had already called it the wedding of the year, though whispers suggested it was more than that. It was the final performance of a dynasty eager to prove its power was still unshaken. The Adedayo Empire had risen over 4 decades like a tower piercing the clouds. Chief Olabode Adedayo, patriarch of the family, had built it with hands that knew no mercy and a mind that feared no rival. Oil fields, shipping lines, luxury hotels, political connections, his name was stitched into the very fabric of Lagos society. Men envied him, women praised him, and governments bowed to him. Yet for all the billions in his accounts and the sprawling estates across Nigeria and beyond, there remained one crown jewel he had yet to display: the perfect wedding of his eldest son, Toby. Today would be that display, polished brighter than gold, to remind every rival that the Adedayo dynasty was eternal. The patriarch left nothing to chance. For months he had commanded an army of planners, architects, chefs, and designers. The church selected was not the modest parish of the family's youth, but a cathedral newly renovated with imported marble and stained glass flown in from Italy. Its towering pillars gleamed white, its roof a dome of gold that caught the morning light like fire. The reception hall, a banquet palace near the lagoon, had been refitted at obscene expense. Chandeliers imported from Paris, roses from South Africa, crystal glasses etched with the family crest. Even the cutlery carried weight in guests' hands, each fork and knife layered with silver and engraved initials. Convoys began to arrive long before the ceremony. Governors stepped out of SUVs, their agbadas shimmering like moving thrones. Business magnates emerged in tailored suits, cufflinks flashing diamonds as cameras captured their every smile. Nollywood stars in gowns that clung like liquid silk strolled past security, waving at crowds gathered beyond the barricades. And then came the foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, oil executives, princes from the Gulf, all descending to bear witness not to love, but to power displayed as theater. The street outside the cathedral roared with photographers, their lenses snapping as though history itself was begging to be recorded. Yet amid the parade of opulence, something fragile lingered. The bride, Amara, sat in the bridal suite of the cathedral, her veil draped loosely over her head. She was breathtaking. Tall, slender, her dark skin glowing against the soft white silk of her gown, her eyes lined with kohl that made them seem like deep pools of secrets. The gown had been stitched in Paris, its train long enough to sweep across half the aisle, its pearls hand-sewn, its veil delicate as spider silk. To any onlooker, she was perfection. Grace incarnate, the very image of a dynasty's pride. But up close, a tremor betrayed her. Her fingers twitched where they gripped the bouquet. Her lips parted as though thirsting for air, and in her eyes, behind the shimmer of beauty, lay an unease that not even diamonds could hide. The patriarch had chosen her carefully. Though officially described as the daughter of a respected business associate, Amara was more than just a bride. She was the dynasty's image polished into flesh. Her beauty would silence critics, her charm would disarm enemies, and her name, stitched to Toby's, would broaden the empire's reach. But no one asked what lay behind her silences, nor why her smile seemed hesitant, nor why her body tensed whenever her gaze fell upon the patriarch. Inside the cathedral, the choir rehearsed one final hymn, their voices soaring, echoing through marble arches like the sound of angels trapped in crystal. Guests filled pews, their perfumes mingling into a heady cloud of jasmine, oud, and sweat. Toby, the groom, stood near the altar in a suit cut sharp enough to slice air, his expression glowing with the self-assuredness of a man who had never known rejection. He smiled at his friends, shook hands with uncles, basked in flashes of cameras. For him, this was not just marriage, it was coronation. His father's empire would pass to him, and Amara was both queen and trophy. But wealth's shine often conceals rust. Beneath the careful orchestration, tension simmered. Kunle, the younger brother, muttered to a cousin about inheritance being swallowed whole by Toby's marriage. Chukwuemeka, the patriarch's daughter, scowled at her mother's endless instructions about how to smile and wave. And somewhere behind the pews, the family's longtime butler, Mr. Adedayo, stood stiff and silent, his eyes scanning every detail as though expecting disaster. The patriarch himself sat front row, his agbada so richly embroidered it seemed spun from sunlight, his cane tipped with gold resting across his knees. He smiled with pride, nodding to governors who bent to greet him, but his fingers tapped restlessly against the cane. He had built an empire of glass, and though it dazzled under light, he alone knew how fragile it truly was. The ceremony began. Trumpets blared, the doors opened. Amara stepped forward, her veil lowered, her train trailing behind her like a river of moonlight. Gasps rose from the crowd. Even the most cynical socialites could not deny her radiance. Cameras flashed like lightning, freezing her every step into memory. She walked slowly, steadily, each step echoing through the cathedral's marble floor like the beat of a drum. Toby's smile widened, the patriarch's chest swelled with pride, the choir's voices rose higher. Yet, as she walked, Amara's eyes flickered restlessly across the crowd. Her breath quickened, the bouquet trembled in her hands. The cathedral, for all its beauty, seemed to close in around her, its air suddenly thick, heavy, suffocating. For a second she nearly faltered, her knees weak beneath the weight of the gaze of hundreds. Then she saw him. A figure, half hidden in the crowd, a man standing silently near the back pews, his face shadowed but unmistakable. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and her bouquet nearly slipped from her trembling hands. Sweat beaded her forehead despite the cool air. She had not expected him here, not today, not ever. And in that moment, her body stiffened with recognition, her spirit twisting with dread. The bride's fingers clenched her bouquet so tightly the petals bent, her eyes locked on the stranger's face. Beneath her veil, her lips trembled. She knew him, and the whisper of his name on her tongue was enough to unravel everything the Adedayo dynasty had built. Wealth has a way of performing for an audience, even when it hides its rot. The cathedral doors had only just closed behind the bride when the full spectacle of the Adedayo dynasty unfurled itself like a play staged for the entire city. Every guest seated in those gilded pews knew they were not there merely to celebrate love. They were there to witness a dynasty polish its crown and parade it under heaven's light. The guests were not ordinary Lagosians. This was the kind of gathering where governors sat beside oil tycoons, where senators leaned forward to whisper into the ears of Nollywood stars, where retired generals rubbed shoulders with CEOs of multinational corporations. Convoys had clogged the roads for hours, spilling guests in silk agbadas, bespoke tuxedos, sequined gowns, and glittering jewels. Cameramen scrambled like paparazzi, flashbulbs exploding as each new arrival stepped onto the red carpet that led into the cathedral's entrance. Even the policemen posted along the street adjusted their postures with pride, as though guarding royalty. In the center of it all sat Chief Olabode Adedayo, patriarch of the house, radiating satisfaction like a man who had not just orchestrated a wedding, but staged a conquest. His agbada shimmered with golden embroidery, its folds heavy with wealth, while his cane, golden-tipped, polished until it reflected the cathedral's stained glass, rested across his lap. Guests bent to greet him, offering rehearsed congratulations, their voices dipped in awe. He accepted them all with the serene pride of a king who knew he was not only admired, but feared. His gaze roamed across the hall like a general surveying the battlefield, every detail of the event under his control, every move choreographed to prove his dynasty was untouchable. Yet behind the practiced smiles, the dynasty itself whispered with unease. Kunle, the younger son, sat stiffly beside his wife, His jaw clenched so tightly, a vein pulsed at his temple. He leaned toward a cousin, his voice barely audible, but the bitterness in his tone unmistakable. Everything flows to Toby, and what remains for the rest of us? Father's empire belongs to him now. We are ghosts in our own house. His wife touched his arm in warning, but Kunle pulled away, his eyes fixed not on the altar but on the patriarch's glowing face. Across the aisle, Chukwuemeka, the only daughter, exchanged an icy glance with her brother. Her makeup was flawless, her lace gown impeccable, but her eyes betrayed impatience. She whispered sharply to her mother, "Even today he flaunts Toby as though the rest of us were ornaments. Do you think the world does not see who carries the burden of this family?" Lady Ifeoma hushed her, forcing a smile toward the guests, her pearls trembling slightly against her throat. Even Toby, standing near the altar, wore his confidence like armor, but cracks showed in the corners of his smile. He gripped the cuff of his sleeve too often, adjusted his bow tie repeatedly, his eyes darting toward his father as though measuring his approval with every passing second. He was heir apparent, but an heir living under a shadow so long it bent even his pride. And then there was the bride, Amara. Seated in a private anteroom moments before her walk down the aisle, she could hear the echoes of the grandeur outside, the booming laughter of governors greeting each other, the choir rehearsing one last refrain, the clicking of cameras like a rain of light against marble walls. She sat in her silk gown, her veil lowered, her fingers gripping her bouquet so tightly her knuckles blanched. Servants fluttered around her, fixing folds of fabric, straightening pearls on her bodice, but she seemed far away, her gaze fixed on the floor as though she stood at the edge of a cliff no one else could see. When she finally stepped into the aisle, the cathedral gasped in unison, as though all breath had been stolen by the sight of her. She was radiant, her gown gleaming under chandelier light, her every step graceful. But for those close enough to notice, her smile trembled at the edges, her lips curved but unsteady, her eyes glassy, not with joy but with strain. To the crowd, she was the crown jewel, the Adedayo dynasty's newest ornament. To herself, she was a secret waiting to detonate. She felt it in the way people looked at her. Politicians' wives eyed her with envy. Businessmen's daughters gossiped behind jeweled fans. She was on display, every move scrutinized, her beauty praised not as her own but as the property of the family she had married into. Even the patriarch's approving nod, visible from the altar, made her feel less like a bride and more like a trophy placed under glass. The weight of that gaze was heavier than the pearls stitched into her gown. And as she walked down the aisle, the whispers of the dynasty reached her ears like venomous snakes in the grass. Two siblings behind her bickered in hushed tones, their voices cutting through the choir's song. "You think father doesn't know? You think he hasn't buried the truth deep enough?" Kunle hissed, his voice sharp with fear. Chukwuemeka leaned close, her lips tight. "Secrets rot, Kunle, and the stench always rises. If that name surfaces today, we are finished." Amara froze mid-step. The choir's voices blurred into distant noise. Her heart hammered against her chest, her breath shallow. That word, name, seared itself into her mind. She did not know who had spoken it loud enough for her ears, but she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders. It was as though her worst fear had already been named, her secret dragged into light. Beneath her veil, Amara's eyes darted toward the source of the whisper, her hands trembling against her bouquet. For a heartbeat she thought she had misheard, but the words burned too clearly. If that name surfaces today, we are finished. Every veil hides more than a face. Some veils hide entire histories. To the world gathered in the cathedral, Amara was a vision of perfection, a goddess veiled in silk and pearls. They saw the shimmer of her gown, the grace of her step, and the elegance she carried like second nature. What they did not see was the weight beneath that veil, the story woven into her bones long before she stepped into the Adedayo dynasty. For Amara was not simply a bride. She was the keeper of a past carefully buried, a past that had finally chosen this day to rise. She was born far from the marble floors and golden chandeliers that now surrounded her. In the small town of Nsukka, Her earliest memories were of cracked walls and tin roofs, of the hum of old generators sputtering through the night, of her mother's quiet hands braiding her hair by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Her father was a ghost, spoken of rarely, always in hushed tones that ended in silence when Amara entered the room. It was her mother's strength that held the household together, a woman who stitched clothes for neighbors, who scraped coins together so her daughter could attend school, who carried secrets in her eyes that she never put into words. Even as a child, Amara had sensed that their poverty was not the whole story. There were times she caught her mother staring at a photograph hidden in the folds of a drawer, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges of a man's face. When Amara asked, her mother would fold the picture away and whisper, "Some questions have no answers, my daughter." Yet in the woman's sorrowful smile, Amara felt the outline of a truth too sharp to touch. Life had carried her from Nsukka to Enugu, then to Lagos, through scholarships won by brilliance and beauty, through doors opened by chance meetings. It was at a charity gala years later that she had first encountered Toby Adedayo, the billionaire's son. He had swept into the hall like a prince, accustomed to adoration, his laugh bold, his gaze burning with charm. Amara, in her simple gown borrowed from a cousin, had caught his attention immediately. To her surprise, he pursued her relentlessly as though she were the rarest prize in the room. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Flowers delivered in golden boxes, dinners at private restaurants guarded by armed escorts, whispered promises beneath chandeliers. To many, it seemed the fairy tale ascent of a girl plucked from obscurity into the arms of power. Yet Amara's heart carried unease. Too many coincidences gnawed at her. The way Toby's father had insisted on meeting her early in their courtship, the sharpness in the patriarch's eyes when he studied her face, the careful but probing questions he asked about her family background. There was a night she would never forget. Toby had taken her to his father's estate for dinner. The patriarch had welcomed her with the smile of a man masking calculation, and midway through the evening, he had stared so long at her that she felt stripped bare. His gaze lingered not with admiration, but with recognition, as if he were seeing a reflection he thought he had erased. That night, when Amara asked Toby about it, he laughed it off. "That's just father. He measures everyone like an investment." But Amara knew better. She had seen something flicker in the old man's eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt. As the wedding approached, the unease grew. At fittings, she would find herself staring at her reflection, wondering whose story she was stepping into. In rehearsals, her hands shook even as the planner praised her poise. She smiled when cameras turned, but in private, she pressed her palms against her stomach to calm the nausea that came not from sickness, but from dread. The night before the wedding, she sat alone in the bridal suite, the air heavy with the scent of roses flown in from abroad. Dresses and jewelry lay around her like armor she had never asked to wear. Exhaustion weighed on her, but sleep would not come. She thought of her mother again, the secrets folded into her silences, and she wondered if marrying into this dynasty was destiny or trap. It was then that the knock came, soft, hesitant, followed by silence. When Amara rose to open the door, she found no one in the corridor, only an envelope slipped beneath the frame, resting on the carpet like a seed of doom. Her heart raced as she picked it up, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, plain, unmarked, the handwriting hurried but legible. The message was brief, only one line. "Do not let them silence you." Her throat closed. Her eyes darted around the room as though shadows themselves might step forward with answers. Who had left it? What did they know? Her pulse hammered as she sat back on the bed, the note clutched in her hand. It was not simply a warning, it was recognition. Someone else knew her secret. Someone else had touched the thread she carried in silence. And if that someone had reached her here, in the heart of the dynasty's fortress, then the truth was closer to erupting than she had dared imagine. Amara stared at the note, her breath shallow, her bouquet trembling in her lap. For the first time she understood with certainty. She was not alone in her secret. Someone else knew. And on this day of all days, that knowledge would not stay buried. Words spoken in joy can be undone by words whispered in fear. The cathedral had been transformed into a palace of light. Gold leaf shimmered on the edges of the high altar, its surface polished until it seemed to mirror the heavens. White roses arched over the pews, their petals scattering a fragrance that clung to every breath. Tall candelabras lined the aisle, their flames steady despite the stir of guests fanning themselves with jewel-studded fans. Above, the stained glass windows caught the morning sun, spilling blues and reds across the marble floor so that the bride's path glowed like a river of fire and water. The choir's voices rose in practiced harmony, their song a tide of praise that seemed to push the moment forward with unstoppable force. At the altar, Toby Adedayo stood tall, his suit cut to perfection, a diamond pin gleaming on his lapel. His smile carried both confidence and entitlement, the expression of a man who believed destiny had always bent in his direction. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, the cameras capturing his every gesture, the congregation erupting with applause, his father's approving nod. To him, marriage was not a beginning but a coronation, the day he stepped fully into the role of heir, apparent to the Adedayo Empire. From the front pew, Chief Olabode Adedayo watched with eyes sharpened by decades of conquest. His agbada glittered with threads of gold, his cane rested beside him like a scepter. Though his smile stretched wide, his fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest, betraying tension. For a man who had silenced rivals, bent governments to his will, and hidden secrets beneath mountains of wealth, control was everything. Yet, as he scanned the cathedral, his gaze lingered too long on the bride's trembling figure at the far end of the aisle. His chest rose and fell more quickly than his measured smile would admit. The doors swung open. A hush fell, swallowing the music, the murmurs, even the rustle of fans. Then the choir surged louder, voices layering in harmonies that rolled like thunder across the cathedral's dome. All eyes turned to Amara. She appeared beneath the archway, framed by roses and light. Her gown shimmered, pearls catching the sun so brightly it was as if the stars themselves had been stitched into fabric. Her veil floated gently with each step, softening the lines of her face, though her eyes, half hidden, gleamed with a tension invisible to the congregation. Guests gasped, whispers rose. A queen, flawless, blessed. For them, she was perfection incarnate, the jewel of the dynasty. But beneath her veil, Amara's breath came shallow, uneven. Her bouquet quivered in her hands. She tried to steady her steps, her heels clicking against marble like the beat of a drum, but her knees threatened to betray her. The rose's fragrance, once sweet, now suffocated. The sunlight fractured by stained glass dazzled her eyes until she felt swallowed by colors too bright. And with every step, the weight of her secret pressed heavier against her chest. She glanced toward the altar. Toby stood radiant, his grin stretching, his hand already extended as though to receive her into his kingdom. Behind him, the patriarch's gaze burned like a brand, watching every tremor, every twitch, as though daring her to falter. Her heart pounded faster, her palms slick within her gloves. Then, through the haze of colors and song, she saw him. A figure among the crowd, seated near the back, not adorned like the rest, not distracted by the glitter. His face was shadowed by the angle of light, but she knew it instantly. Recognition stabbed her like a blade through silk. Her breath caught, her step faltered, her bouquet tilted as her grip weakened. For a second, the cathedral spun, voices blending into a muffled roar. She forced herself forward, though her body screamed retreat. The figure did not move, only watched, his gaze anchoring hers, pulling her into memories she had spent her life burying. He should not have been here. He could not have been here. Yet there he was, as real as the roses at her feet. Her body trembled harder. Sweat dampened her brow beneath the veil, trickling down her temples. She tried to blink it away, but the veil trapped the heat, suffocating. The closer she came to the altar, the more the air thickened, pressing against her chest until each breath rasped. The priest welcomed her, his voice warm, rehearsed, carrying across the hall. "We gather today in joy, to join these two in holy matrimony." Guests smiled, nodded, leaned closer. Cameras flashed, but Amara barely heard him. The The words washed over her like distant rain. Her gaze flicked back to the stranger in the pews, her chest tightening. The vows began. Toby's voice rang clear, steady, proud. I, Toby Adedayo, take you, Amara. Applause swelled as he spoke, his eyes glistening with victory. He squeezed her hand tightly, too tightly, as though to anchor her into a reality she no longer occupied. It was her turn. The priest turned to her, his smile reassuring. Repeat after me. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat constricted, her chest heaving. The bouquet slipped in her grip, petals bending under the force of her trembling. Whispers rippled through the congregation. Toby frowned, whispering, Amara, are you all right? Her vision blurred. The figure in the crowd sharpened, his gaze unrelenting. The choir's voices rose higher, soaring to the ceiling, but inside her ears, a single word screamed louder than all the hymns combined. The name that had haunted her mother's silences, the name tied to the dynasty's darkest shadow. Her knees buckled, gasps erupted. The bouquet tumbled from her hands, scattering petals across marble like drops of blood. Her veil fluttered as her body lurched forward. Guests surged to their feet, confusion crackling like fire. Just before her body struck the floor, Amara's lips parted, and a single name slipped from her mouth, a whisper so faint it seemed swallowed by the choir, yet so sharp it sliced through the patriarch's composure like a blade. A whisper can be louder than a shout when it carries a buried truth. For a heartbeat, silence engulfed the cathedral. The choir's voices faltered, instruments choked mid-note, and hundreds of guests froze as though a phantom hand had pressed pause on the performance of grandeur. Then the silence shattered. Gasps cracked like glass, high-pitched screams rippled from pew to pew, and chairs scraped violently against marble as guests leapt to their feet. Photographers stumbled forward, cameras flashing, eager to capture chaos they had not been invited to witness. Women clutched their pearls, men barked questions at one another, and ushers struggled in vain to restore order. The aisle that had just shimmered with roses and candlelight became a corridor of confusion, petals trampled under polished shoes as people swarmed closer. At the center of it all lay Amara, sprawled on the marble floor, her veil twisted, bouquet scattered, pearls from her gown loose like spilled stars. Her body was limp, her chest heaving faintly, and her lips still trembled with the ghost of the word she had whispered. Toby dropped to his knees beside her, his diamond pins scraping the marble. His hands shook as he lifted her shoulders, his voice rising above the din. Amara! Amara, what's happening? Can you hear me? His panic was raw, unfiltered, the swagger stripped from him in an instant. He pressed his ear closer, desperate to catch the word again. What did you say? He begged, his face drenched in sweat, his jaw trembling. But the name, though faint, had already begun to spread. It slipped from the lips of those seated nearest, whispered at first in disbelief, then carried outward like a spark in dry grass. She said Chukwuemeka. Another repeated it louder. Soon the name rolled across pews, spoken in tones of shock and recognition. Chukwuemeka? Who is Chukwuemeka? Why that name? What does it mean? And while confusion rose like smoke, all eyes turned toward the patriarch. Chief Olabode Adedayo sat frozen in the front pew, his cane gripped so tightly his knuckles whitened. The color drained from his face, his jaw locked, and for the first time in decades, the mask of control slipped. His eyes, normally sharp and unyielding, flickered with something rarely seen in him, fear. He had heard the name, more clearly than anyone else, and though hundreds might not know its weight, he did. The sound of it struck him like a hammer to the chest, splintering through layers of arrogance and authority. The governor beside him leaned in, whispering, "Chief, what's wrong? Who is that?" But the patriarch did not answer. His breath came ragged, his gaze fixed not on his fainting bride, not on his kneeling son, but on the shadows at the back of the cathedral where the figure had stood. That figure was gone now, vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only the echo of a name as his mark. The hall erupted further. Politicians whispered furiously among themselves, their expressions shifting from confusion to calculation. Socialites leaned close, their jeweled ears itching for scandal. Journalists pressed forward, already framing headlines in their minds. The Adedayo dynasty, long untouchable, suddenly looked vulnerable. Lady Ifeoma rose, her pearls quivering against her throat as she pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "Get her water!" "Someone call the doctor," she cried, her voice breaking through the chaos. Ushers rushed, carrying Amara's limp form toward the side chamber, her veil trailing across marble like a torn banner. But Toby would not let go. His hands clutched at his bride, his voice sharp with disbelief. "She spoke a name," he muttered again and again, his eyes darting between her pale face and his father's rigid expression. He turned on the patriarch, desperation painted across his features. "Father, why does that name terrify you?" The words struck the hall like another explosion. Guests stilled, leaning forward, ears straining. Cameras flashed once more, their lights freezing the moment into evidence. All eyes fell on the patriarch, the king of Lagos society, as his son's voice cracked through the cathedral's gilded walls. Toby's gaze locked on his father, his voice louder now, trembling with both fear and accusation. "Why does that name terrify you?" Silence is a fortress, but once cracked, it crumbles. For decades, Chief Olabode Adedayo had relied on silence as his greatest shield. Rivals might accuse, whispers might circulate, but as long as the dynasty spoke louder, richer, and more powerfully than the streets, silence remained a fortress protecting him from ruin. Yet, in that cathedral, with a single whispered name, the fortress cracked. The air carried panic, suspicion, and recognition, and though the patriarch's lips never moved, his eyes betrayed what he feared most. The fortress would not hold. He rose from the pew with the precision of a soldier marching into battle. His agbada swept around him like a cloak of fire, his cane clattering once against marble for emphasis. "Enough!" he thundered, his voice cutting through the cathedral's confusion. The hall, stilled for a breath, startled by the sheer force of his command. Then he barked orders to the security guards who lined the aisles. "Clear this hall! No cameras, no voices! Remove them now!" Uniformed guards surged forward, their boots striking marble in unison. Guests, startled but not entirely obedient, protested as they were ushered toward the exits. Politicians grumbled, waving their hands as though they could not be treated like common spectators. Socialites hissed, clutching purses and pearls, trying to stall for one more glance at the chaos. The journalists resisted hardest, cameras raised even as guards shoved them back, but the patriarch's glare was a weapon sharper than fists. "Seize those!" he barked, and one camera was ripped from a man's hands, its flashbulb exploding uselessly against the floor. Amara, limp and pale, was carried swiftly into a side chamber near the vestry, her veil torn and trailing like a fallen flag. The doctor summoned to attend her pressed fingers to her wrist, whispering quick instructions. Lady Ifeoma followed, tears streaking her powdered cheeks, her voice cracking as she cried, "Let her breathe, please, for heaven's sake, let her breathe." Behind them, Toby hovered, his face twisted between panic for his bride and suspicion of his father, his hands trembling as they brushed pearls from her gown. But the guests did not leave quietly. They buzzed like hornets, their whispers louder than hymns. "Did you hear the name?" He turned pale. Why did the patriarch freeze? Their voices carried down the marble corridors, even as guards pushed them toward the doors. Politicians leaned close to one another, murmuring calculations, reputations to protect, alliances to reconsider, contracts to distance from. More than one senator hissed into his phone, instructing aides to monitor the situation before it poisoned their own careers. In a small chamber adjoining the cathedral, Chief Olabode stood alone with his butler, Mr. Adewale. His face, stripped of its public mask, was thunderclouds and fury. He slammed his cane against the wall, the crack echoing through stone. How dare she? How dare anyone speak that name here? His chest heaved, his breath ragged, his hand trembling with rage as he pointed at the butler. "Find who whispered it to her. Find them, Adewale, and silence them. If one more word leaves this building, we are finished." The butler bowed low, his face expressionless, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, missed nothing. He had seen the patriarch panic. He had seen fear flicker where arrogance once reigned. And though he nodded, murmuring, "Yes, Chief." His mind was already racing ahead, tallying the cost of silence in a world that no longer obeyed it. Back in the cathedral, as guests trickled reluctantly toward the exits, one man remained crouched behind a pillar. A photographer, not one of the official press but a freelancer hungry for fame, had slipped past the guards in the chaos. His lens, long and sharp, peered between roses and shadows. He did not waste time on the fainting bride. Others had captured that. His eyes fixed instead on the patriarch himself, his face drained, his hand trembling against his cane. The image was priceless. With a silent click, the shutter captured it. The king of Lagos society stripped of composure. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Victoria Island. Guests spilled into convoys, phones buzzing, fingers flying across screens. Messages leapt from guest to friend to social circles, from social circles to blogs. The whispers had already left the cathedral, galloping into the city's bloodstream. Something happened at the Adedayo wedding. The bride fainted. She whispered a name. Screens lit up, notifications chimed, gossip hardened into rumor. Inside the patriarch's limousine, silence reigned heavy. Lady Ifeoma clutched her rosary, muttering prayers. Toby sat stiff, staring out the window, his reflection warped in the tinted glass. The patriarch leaned back, eyes closed, fingers clenched so tightly the veins on his hand bulged. His voice was low, venomous. "This ends tonight. No one will speak of it again." But the city had already begun speaking. That night, as the patriarch dined alone in his study, his phone buzzed with a notification. He unlocked it, expecting a message from an ally. Instead, the screen glared back at him with horror. A headline splashed across a popular blog. "The Chief's Fear. Exclusive photo from the Adedayo wedding." Beneath the words was the image, sharp and merciless. Chief Olabode Adedayo, his face pale, his hand trembling against his golden cane, eyes wide with unmistakable fear. The patriarch's hand shook harder as he dropped the phone, his chest tightening. His fortress had cracked, and the first image of its collapse was already viral before midnight. Names carry weight, some carry entire dynasties down with them. By dawn the next morning, Lagos was already buzzing like a restless hive. The whispers that had escaped the cathedral had multiplied in the night, leaping from one tongue to another, carried across WhatsApp groups, spilled into beer parlors, whispered in salons, and amplified across the radio. By sunrise, what had been a faint murmur had become a storm. The city thrived on stories, and this one was irresistible. A bride had fainted during her vows, whispered a name, and the patriarch of the Adedayo dynasty had turned pale in front of thousands. Newsstands displayed front pages that screamed with drama. "Mystery name at Billionaire wedding," one tabloid blared, accompanied by a blurred image of Amara being carried out of the cathedral. Another ran the photo that had gone viral overnight, Chief Olabode's trembling hand and drained face, his eyes wide with something far too close to fear. The caption beneath it was merciless. "What frightens the chief?" Talk shows seized the scandal with relish. On morning television, anchors sat with furrowed brows, replaying footage captured by guests. They slowed the video down, mouths close to microphones, analyzing lip movements, debating what the bride had whispered before collapsing. "It sounded like Chukwuemeka," one insisted, rewinding the clip. "No, perhaps it was Chukwuemeka," argued another. The speculation grew louder than facts, but in Lagos, perception often mattered more than truth. On radio stations, callers flooded lines. One woman cried out, "How can a bride faint on such a day unless there was something evil at play?" Another caller, a man with a deep voice, said, "Mark my words, this is not fainting, it is revelation. These rich men, they hide too much. God is exposing them." Each call fed the frenzy, each opinion layering over the last until the city itself vibrated with scandal. In the markets, traders abandoned gossip of fuel prices to argue about the name. In office towers on Victoria Island, employees leaned across desks, whispering theories instead of answering emails. In Danfos, crawling through Third Mainland Bridge traffic, Passengers huddled, speculating about the Adedayo fortune and what shadow had fallen upon it. Even in churches, pastors adjusted sermons, warning congregations that the truth always comes out, no matter how wealthy the sinner. Meanwhile, the patriarch's allies were already scrambling. Politicians who had once clung to him as a pillar of influence quietly distanced themselves. Invitations to private dinners were suddenly withdrawn. Promises of contracts evaporated. Men who once boasted of being close to the chief now told reporters, "I barely know him. We only met at official functions." The dynasty's power, so long untouchable, was beginning to rot from the inside out. Inside the Adedayo mansion, silence reigned heavy. Lady Ifeoma wept privately, her rosary beads slick with tears, unable to understand how decades of careful image could unravel in a single day. Kunle cursed under his breath, pacing halls, convinced that Toby's wedding had cursed the family's name. Chiamaka locked herself in a room, avoiding calls from gossiping friends who begged for details. And Toby, still shaken, hovered near Amara, torn between anger and fear. Amara herself refused to retreat into silence. She sat in her bridal suite, no longer adorned in pearls but in a simple robe, her face pale but resolute. Family friends urged her to deny everything, to call her collapse a matter of nerves, to insist she had whispered nothing at all. But she shook her head, her eyes steady. "No," she said quietly. "I spoke what I knew, and I will not unspeak it." Her family, poor and overwhelmed by the scale of scandal, begged her to think of her safety. But Amara felt a strange calm settle over her. For years she had carried the weight of her mother's silences, the unanswered questions of her childhood. Now, for the first time, her truth was no longer a private burden. It was part of the world. The patriarch, however, raged in private. In his study, he stormed back and forth, phone pressed to his ear as he called old allies, demanding loyalty, threatening consequences. "You will not breathe a word of this," he growled to a senator. "Do you forget who built your campaign?" But the replies were tepid, evasive. His threats, once weapons, now sounded like hollow echoes. Power that had cowed men for decades seemed suddenly fragile, its foundation shaking. And then, as the city bristled with rumor, the journalists made their move. A mid-tier online publication, hungry for attention, published a bold headline at dusk. "A forgotten heir lives among us. Brides whisper, hints at Billionaire's dark past." The article was light on evidence, heavy on speculation, but it named the whispered word, Chukwuemeka. It suggested the bride had called out the name of a hidden son, a child erased from the patriarch's records decades ago. The piece claimed, without proof, that the Adedayo empire had been built not only on business genius, but on betrayal, that the dynasty had stolen inheritance from a silenced bloodline. Within minutes, the headline spread across WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram. Hashtags trended, hashtag forgotten heir, hashtag Adedayo secrets, hashtag the whispered name. Memes bloomed, jokes danced alongside outrage, and ordinary Lagosians who had never glimpsed the inside of a cathedral now dissected the Adedayo legacy as if it were their own inheritance. In the mansion's dimly lit study, Chief Olabode stared at the screen, his face a mask of fury and dread. The article's final line glared at him like prophecy. "A forgotten heir lives among us." The past never stays buried, it waits in silence until it is spoken. Chief Olabode Adedayo had always believed his greatest talent was not in building empires, but in erasing mistakes. For every oil field he acquired, there was a rival silenced. For every shipping contract signed, there was a regulation bent. And for every jewel added to his dynasty, there was a shadow cast long behind it. In his youth, when ambition burned hotter than caution, he had committed one sin he thought he had sealed away forever. Now, as the whispers of Chukwuemeka reverberated across Lagos, that sin clawed its way back into the light. Decades earlier, when his empire was still in its infancy, Olabode had been a man of both hunger and recklessness. He was already married to Ifeoma, the woman who had given his family elegance and social legitimacy, but his appetites were larger than vows could contain. In Port Harcourt, during an extended business trip negotiating oil concessions, he met a woman whose beauty was not gilded but raw, unpolished, magnetic. Her name was Neka. She was young, vibrant, and unlike the society women he dined with in Lagos, she spoke to him not with fear but with equal fire. Their affair burned quickly, passionately, hidden in the shadows of hotel rooms and coastal villas. For Olabode, it was a distraction, a spark of freedom from the burdens of empire. For Neka, it became everything. When she told him she was carrying his child, he had laughed at first, dismissing it as an inconvenience to be solved with money. But when she refused to disappear, when she insisted their child deserved recognition, his ambition twisted into cruelty. The boy was born in a small clinic on the outskirts of the city, a healthy infant with dark eyes that mirrored his father's intensity. Neka named him Chukwuemeka. God has done great, believing that even if the man who fathered him would not embrace him, destiny might. But destiny, in the hands of men like Olabode, was often rewritten with ink and bribes. At first, he provided. Quiet envelopes of cash delivered monthly, a small house in a forgotten neighborhood, a guard posted at a distance to ensure silence. But as his empire grew, so too did the danger of exposure. Rivals began whispering, journalists poked around, and politicians who envied his rise dug for dirt. The existence of a child outside his marriage, an illegitimate heir, was ammunition too powerful to leave in enemy hands. So Olabode did what he had always done. He erased. Records of the clinic birth vanished after he bribed officials. Neka's landlord received an offer to evict her, forcing her into obscurity. Friends who dared ask about the boy found themselves without jobs, their businesses shuttered overnight. And when Neka attempted once more to confront him, arriving at his Lagos estate with the child in her arms, he humiliated her, casting her out before the gates with words that sliced deeper than knives. This child does not exist. He never will. The boy, Chukwuemeka, grew up in the margins, fatherless, nameless in official records, raised by a mother who carried bitterness alongside love. She told him often of the man who had rejected him, and though she tried to bury her anger in prayer, the child absorbed it, carrying the weight of a legacy denied. He grew tall, strong, and restless, drifting between jobs, his name whispered occasionally in Lagos slums, a ghost tethered to a living dynasty. And though Olabode convinced himself he had buried the scandal, he knew deep down the grave was shallow. Each time he looked at Toby, his legitimate son, he felt the phantom of another boy's eyes staring back at him, accusing. Each anniversary of his empire's triumphs reminded him of the cost: a son erased, a mother abandoned, a bloodline fractured. He had told himself time would smother the past, but time, like silence, always betrayed. Amara's presence in his household had been a cruel twist of fate. Though she did not know the full truth at first, her mother had been connected to the world that Neka once inhabited. Whispers had reached her ears, scraps of letters hidden in trunks, conversations overheard in markets. Amara had grown up with the ghost of the name Chukwuemeka lingering in the background, a secret passed down not in records but in fear. When she found the diary among her late mother's belongings, a diary that mentioned meetings with Neka, the anguish of her betrayal, and the plea to never forget the boy, Amara pieced together a truth that chilled her. By the time she stood in the cathedral, veil trembling, she knew the whispered name was no accident. It was not fainting that overtook her, but the unbearable weight of truth demanding release. Her lips spoke it because silence could no longer hold. Back in the present, Chief Olabode stormed through the mansion's private study, the headlines flashing across his phone screen like curses. He could not let the city connect the dots, not now, not when his empire hung by threads. He turned on Mr. Adedayo, the butler who had served him faithfully for 3 decades. The man stood stiff, hands behind his back, expression unreadable. "Erase it," Olabode commanded, his voice low, dangerous. "Every file, every record, every witness. I don't care what it takes. Burn it all before the world finds it." Adedayo bowed slightly, his voice measured. "Yes, Chief. but in his eyes flickered something the patriarch did not notice, a spark of recognition, perhaps even defiance. As the patriarch's voice thundered through the study, his final command cut the air like a blade. Erase everything before the world finds it. Empires don't fall in a day. They crack in whispers before collapsing in thunder. For decades, the Adedayo Empire had been more than wealth. It was an institution, a shadow parliament that shaped Lagos behind closed doors. When the patriarch spoke, politicians listened. When his name appeared on a contract, signatures followed. His handshake was as binding as law, his smile a currency more stable than the naira. But in the days after the cathedral scandal, the empire began to tremble. It did not fall in one dramatic collapse, but in subtle refusals, unanswered calls, and doors that once swung open, now locked in silence. The first crack came from the political class. Governors who had attended the wedding with pomp and smiles now kept their distance. A scheduled meeting with the Minister of Petroleum was postponed indefinitely. A senator who once bragged of dining at the patriarch's table told reporters, "I have always respected Chief Adedayo, but I am not privy to his private affairs." Contracts in oil exploration, deals years in the making, were suddenly under review. It was as though the entire establishment, sensing blood in the water, had agreed to let the empire bleed alone. The second crack came from the markets. Share prices in Adedayo shipping fell sharply within 48 hours, investors pulling out not because of numbers, but because of perception. Whispers of illegitimacy, of fraud, of hidden heirs, infected balance sheets. Bankers who once competed to extend credit now demanded guarantees. The dynasty's businesses had not yet collapsed, but the tremor was felt in every boardroom. And through it all, the media dug deeper. What began as speculation hardened into investigation. Journalists unearthed old property records in Port Harcourt, noting unexplained cash payments to a woman named Neka. A mid-level civil servant, long retired, told a reporter of missing birth records from a certain year. Radio talk shows, once filled with music and chatter, now pulsed with callers debating legitimacy, morality, and the arrogance of the rich. Even comedians on Instagram reels mocked the scandal, imitating a fainting bride and whispering "Chukwuemeka" as if it were a punchline. The more the patriarch tried to silence it, the louder it grew. Inside the mansion, tension thickened like smoke. Guards who once strutted now stood uneasily at their posts, whispering among themselves. Staff walked on eggshells, for the patriarch's temper had become volcanic. He snapped at servants for misplacing cutlery, roared at his driver for hitting a pothole, cursed at his lawyers for bringing him excuses instead of solutions. Fear gripped the household, but beneath it, something else stirred. Curiosity. Everyone had heard the name. No one dared ask what it meant, but all felt the weight of its shadow. Toby, the groom, simmered with rage. He paced the marble corridors like a man trapped in a cage, his thoughts circling endlessly. He replayed the moment at the altar, the fainting, the whisper, the tremor in his father's face. His pride, once fed by the dynasty's glow, now burned with humiliation. Guests had watched him beg for answers beside his unconscious bride. Cameras had caught the panic in his eyes. He had been reduced from heir to spectacle in a single instant. On the third night after the wedding, he cornered his father in the study. "You will tell me," he demanded, his voice low but dangerous. "That name, why did she say it? Why did you freeze? Why does it haunt you?" The patriarch glared at him, his cane tapping against the carpet. "You forget yourself, boy. You are speaking to your father." "I am speaking to a liar," Toby snapped, his fists clenched. "The world is laughing at me, at us, and you stand there with your silence while the empire rots. I deserve the truth." Chief Olabode's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was heavier than words, and Toby stormed out, the echo of his steps like gunshots through the hall. In her suite, Amara slowly regained her strength. The fainting had passed, but the weight of what she had spoken lingered. Her mother's diary lay hidden in her belongings, its pages etched into her memory. She could no longer pretend ignorance, no longer hide behind silence. When Toby entered, his face twisted with fury and desperation, she saw at once the storm inside him. He grabbed her, hands, his grip urgent. "Amara," he said, his voice breaking. "What did you say?" "Tell me it was nonsense. Tell me it meant nothing." She stared into his eyes, her own filled with both sorrow and resolve. Her lips trembled, but her voice came steady. "The name I spoke," she whispered, "is real." Toby froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes wide. The truth was no longer a rumor, it had just been confirmed by the bride herself. Truth can break hearts before it breaks empires. The night was heavy inside the Adedayo mansion. The chandeliers blazed with light as though brightness could chase away scandal, yet every corner of the great house seemed darker than usual, its walls pressing in like conspirators. Toby had not slept since the wedding. His eyes were red, his face lined with exhaustion, his pride cracked open by shame. And Amara, seated across from him in her chamber, finally knew she could not delay the inevitable. She reached under her dressing table and pulled out a small box, worn at the edges, the wood smooth from years of handling. Inside lay the diary that had traveled with her from Nsuka, hidden among her mother's few belongings. She placed it gently on the table between them. "This is why," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "This is where the name came from." Toby frowned, confusion knitting his brows. He picked up the diary, flipping through pages filled with careful handwriting, faded but still legible. His eyes scanned lines that spoke of friendship and betrayal, of a woman named Neka who had borne a child in silence, of a man of power who had denied him. And there, circled again and again, was the name, Chukwuemeka. The words cut him more deeply than any weapon. His hands shook as he turned each page, the truth unraveling the foundation of the life he had always believed unshakable. The boy his father had erased was real. The name his bride whispered was not madness or hysteria. It was history, returning like a ghost, demanding recognition. Toby's voice cracked as he dropped the diary onto the table. "My father," he said, choking on the word. "All my life, he preached honor, strength, legacy. And all this time, he buried his shame beneath our name. His fists clenched, his jaw trembled. He made me heir to an empire built on lies." Amara's eyes filled with tears, but her gaze did not waver. "I did not want this truth to be mine," she said softly, "but my mother lived with its shadow. She carried the pain of a woman silenced, and I inherited it. I could not walk into this family, into this marriage, and continue the silence. When I saw that figure in the cathedral, when the memory of the name rose in me, I could not hold it back. I whispered it because truth demanded it." Toby turned away, his chest heaving, his reflection fractured in the mirror before him. He wanted to rage at her, to accuse her of destroying everything, but he could not. The diary's words were undeniable. The betrayal belonged not to Amara, but to his father. And the more he thought on it, the more his love for Amara mingled with an ache he had never known, the ache of knowing his bloodline was tainted by deceit. It was then that the door burst open. The patriarch stood in the threshold, his cane tapping once against the floor like a gavel striking judgment. His eyes blazed, his face pale yet thunderous. "Enough," he growled. "This poison ends tonight." Toby stiffened, fury flashing across his face. "Father, you lied to us. To me. Is it true? Was there another son? Did you erase him?" Chief Olabode's gaze shifted to Amara, cold as steel. "You," he hissed, his voice dripping venom, "you brought this rot into my house. You think because you wear my son's ring you can tarnish my name? Do you know what you risk? You think Lagos will protect you? You are nothing but a girl plucked from dust." Amara stood, her body trembling but her chin lifted. Her voice, though quiet, cut through his fury. "I am the daughter of a woman you and your kind destroyed. You erased her pain, but you cannot erase mine. You can threaten me, but I will not be silent." The patriarch advanced, his cane striking the floor with each step, his presence suffocating. "Do you know what silence is worth? It has bought empires, crushed enemies, protected generations. Speak one more word, and you will vanish from this city before sunrise." Toby moved between them, his chest heaving, his voice raw. "If she vanishes, then so do I. I will not inherit your lies." The room quaked with the weight of broken loyalties. For the first time, the patriarch saw defiance not from enemies outside his gates, but from within his bloodline. His son's eyes, once mirrors of obedience, now burned with rebellion. His bride, meant to be the jewel of the dynasty, now stood as its greatest threat. Amara's fear was real. Her hands shook, her knees weakened, but beneath it, courage surged. She thought of her mother, bent over a sewing machine late at night, whispering prayers no one heard. She thought of the hunger, the shame, the years lived under the shadow of a man who denied his own blood, and she thought of herself, standing now with the power to break the silence that had strangled her family for decades. When the patriarch stormed out, slamming the door so hard the chandelier trembled, Amara sat back down, her hands pressed tightly around the diary. Toby sat beside her, burying his face in his palms, whispering, "What do we do now?" Amara's gaze hardened. She could not undo what she had spoken, but she could decide what came next. The truth could no longer remain trapped between the marble walls of the mansion. It needed to be spoken where it mattered. That night, while the household slept in uneasy silence, Amara took a small phone from her drawer. Her fingers shook as she typed a number given to her in secrecy by a trusted family friend, a lawyer known for his quiet ties to the EFCC. She hesitated only for a moment, then pressed send. As the line connected, Amara whispered into the receiver, "This is about Chief Olabode Adedayo and the name he tried to erase." When truth knocks, even the strongest gates cannot hold. The first knock came not on the patriarch's door, but on the desks of quiet offices in Abuja. A file landed in the hands of an EFCC investigator, thin at first, but heavy in implication. Inside were photographs, anonymous testimonies, and a copy of the diary Amara had entrusted through her ally. At the top of the file, scrawled in black ink, was the name that had unsettled Lagos, Chukwuemeka. The EFCC moved quietly at first. Investigators slipped into banks under the guise of routine checks, tracing transfers that stretched back decades. Old contracts were dusted off, signatures scrutinized, dates compared. What emerged was not merely the story of an illegitimate child, but of payments made to silence him, funds siphoned into shell companies, and property registered in names that no longer existed. Each discovery added weight to the case, each revelation cracking the fortress the patriarch had built. But secrets cannot stay quiet in a city that thrives on noise. By the end of the week, whispers of the EFCC's involvement leaked into the press. Headlines screamed across Lagos, "Adedayo fortune under investigation." Television anchors announced with solemn faces that investigators were probing allegations of fraud and concealed heirs. The same cathedral footage replayed nightly, Amara's fainting freeze-framed, the patriarch's panic dissected frame by frame. What began as gossip had hardened into official scrutiny, and the Adedayo empire quaked. The first blow struck the patriarch's accounts. On a Tuesday morning, he awoke to find several of his bank assets frozen, his personal cards declined. A butler reported that staff salaries could not be processed. Contractors called in fury, demanding to know why payments had vanished. Rage boiled in his chest as he slammed his phone against the table, shouting, "No one freezes my money!" No one. But the freeze was real, authorized by law, and beyond even his reach. The second blow came publicly. EFCC officials, clad in dark jackets emblazoned with bold white letters, arrived at the gates of one of his smaller estates in Ikoyi. They moved with quiet efficiency, cameras trailing them as they loaded boxes of files and hard drives into black vans. The footage aired that same night, replayed endlessly, commentators discussing the humiliation of a man who once dined with presidents. Inside the Adedayo mansion, chaos spread like a contagion. Family dinners devolved into shouting matches. Kunle, already bitter at Toby's favored status, accused his brother of inviting ruin by marrying Amara. "She was planted to destroy us," he hissed. Chukwuemeka retorted, her voice sharp as glass. No, it is father's sins that destroy us. We are paying the price for secrets he buried. Even Lady Ifeoma, once a portrait of silent loyalty, broke down in sobs, whispering, "What have you done to us, Olabode?" The patriarch denied everything. To his children, to his staff, to the cameras that ambushed his convoy, his words were the same. Lies. Malicious lies. His voice thundered with the authority of a man accustomed to being believed, but his eyes betrayed the cracks. Each time the name Chukwuemeka was uttered, his face twitched, his grip tightened on his cane, his body stiffened as though struck by lightning. Denial had been his shield, but the shield was full of holes. The family turned against itself. Toby confronted Kunle, shouting, "You think you can inherit a kingdom built on sand?" "There is nothing left to inherit," Kunle sneered, "better sand than scandal. You brought this shame with your bride." Chukwuemeka shrieked that both brothers were fools, while Lady Ifeoma retreated into prayer, clutching her rosary as if it could hold back the tide. Servants whispered in corridors, guards exchanged knowing looks. Everyone in the mansion felt the tremors of an empire collapsing. The media frenzy only deepened. Newspapers carried exposés with titles like "The Hidden Bloodline" and "Erased Heirs of Nigeria's Richest." Talk shows invited historians to discuss how dynasties across Africa had crumbled under the weight of illegitimate heirs. On social media, hashtags trended daily. Memes painted the patriarch as a crumbling statue, and the whispered name became a weapon wielded by comedians and critics alike. Every corner of the city hummed with the same question: who was Chukwuemeka, and where was he now? The patriarch responded with fury. He tightened security at the mansion, forbidding journalists from approaching, instructing guards to seize phones from anyone caught taking photographs. He shouted at his lawyers, demanding injunctions, though the courts moved slowly and the tide of public opinion moved faster. He paced the halls like a lion in a shrinking cage, snapping at staff until many quit outright, unwilling to weather the storm. And then came the envelope. It arrived by courier late in the evening, a thick cream paper stamped with the seal of the Federal High Court. The butler carried it to the study, placing it silently on the patriarch's desk. Chief Olabode stared at it for a long moment, his hands unmoving, his chest rising and falling in heavy breaths. He tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside, the summons was blunt, its language sharp as steel. He was ordered to appear before the court to answer charges of fraud, concealment of assets, and inheritance manipulation. But it was not his name alone that shook him. It was the second page, where the list of witnesses was printed in bold type. At the very top was hers, Amara Adedayo. The patriarch's breath hitched as he read the name again, his vision blurring with rage. His bride, the jewel meant to crown his dynasty, was now summoned as the voice that could destroy it. Some weddings end with rings. This one ended with subpoenas. The Federal High Court in Lagos had never seen such spectacle. On the morning of the trial, the steps outside the grand white building looked like the entrance to a stadium. Journalists swarmed the gates, their cameras flashing like restless lightning, microphones thrust at anyone remotely connected to the Adedayo name. Spectators lined the barricades, murmuring prayers, shouting curses, and straining for a glimpse of the fallen dynasty. The whispers that had once spread in salons and markets were now hardening into evidence under the weight of the law. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The courtroom, cavernous and solemn, brimmed with rows of journalists scribbling furiously into notepads, photographers crouched like hunters, and curious Lagosians who had queued for hours to witness the trial of a man once considered untouchable. Every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the wooden dock where Chief Olabode Adedayo sat, his once commanding presence diminished under the stark glare of fluorescent lights. He wore his agbada as if it were armor, but even the golden embroidery could not conceal his gauntness. His cane rested against his chair, his hand gripping it tightly, as though it was the last weapon he had left. His face was pale, his lips pressed thin, and yet his eyes retained the sharpness of a predator unwilling to surrender. Around him, An army of lawyers sat in tailored suits, their leather briefcases stacked with documents, their voices already rehearsed to shred the prosecution's case. Opposite them sat the EFCC's representatives, stern, methodical men and women in dark jackets, accompanied by Amara, the bride who had whispered the name that unraveled it all. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady despite the 100 eyes fixed on her. She wore no pearls, no silk gown, only a modest navy dress that made her look less like a bride and more like a witness of history. At her side sat Toby, his face taut, his hands clenched, his body leaned toward her, protective yet conflicted. He loved her still, but every truth she spoke struck at the foundations of the empire he once longed to inherit. The trial began with ceremony. The judge entered, his robe flowing, his gavel striking wood with a sound that silenced the chatter instantly. "This court," he declared, "is convened to examine allegations of fraud, concealment, and inheritance manipulation against Chief Oluboda Adedayo." The EFCC presented first. Their lead prosecutor, a woman with a voice as sharp as steel, stood and laid out the case with deliberate precision. She spoke of missing records in Port Harcourt, of unexplained payments traced to shell companies, of property acquisitions under false names. She told the story of a hidden child, erased from official documents but not from memory, a son named Chukwuemeka. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately, to Amara. "Your Honor, we call our first witness." The room shifted. Every camera lens pointed to the bride. Every pen hovered above paper. Amara rose, her knees trembling, but her back straight. She walked to the witness stand, her navy dress brushing the polished floor. She raised her hand, swore her oath, and sat, her voice low but clear as she began. She told them about her childhood in Nasuka, about her mother's struggles, about the diary hidden in a box. She spoke of the name that haunted her family, the whispers of a forgotten boy, the sorrow her mother carried to her grave. She recounted the notes slipped beneath her dressing table on her wedding day. "Do not let them silence you." And she told them of the moment in the cathedral, when truth could no longer be buried, and the name left her lips like a confession she had never rehearsed. Gasps rose, murmurs swept across the courtroom, and the judge struck his gavel. "Order! This court will have order." The patriarch's lawyers pounced. One rose, tall, eloquent, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mrs. Adedayo," he began, "you claim to speak truth, yet what evidence do you have? A diary? Scribbles on yellowed pages? Are we to dismantle an empire because of a girl's fainting spell and a story whispered in shadows?" He turned to the judge, gesturing dramatically. "This is slander dressed as justice. My client's reputation is being crucified on the altar of gossip." The court hummed with tension. Amara's hands trembled, but her eyes did not falter. "It is not gossip," she said firmly. "It is blood." The lawyer sneered. "And yet you have no proof that blood ever existed. Show us this supposed child. Produce him. Without that, your words are wind." The prosecution moved swiftly, cutting through the bluster. "Your Honor," the EFCC's lawyer interjected, "we have documents." She snapped her fingers, and two officers wheeled forward a trolley stacked with files. Property records in Port Harcourt, bank transfers under aliases, hospital registries with erased names, but traces remain, and all of them, she said, her voice echoing, circle back to one name, Chukwuemeka. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the stack of evidence. The courtroom erupted with murmurs, journalists scribbling furiously. Toby buried his face in his hands, torn between the love for his bride and the horror of seeing his father's empire dissected before strangers. Chief Olabode shifted in his chair, his cane tapping against the floor. His lips moved silently, as if whispering a prayer or curse only he could hear. The fortress he had built with silence was being dismantled brick by brick, not by rivals outside, but by truth carried on his own bloodline. The lawyers on his side rose again, clawing at credibility. They accused Amara of being a plant, of seeking fortune through scandal. They argued she was manipulated by enemies who envied the Adedayo name. But their words, once powerful, rang hollow against the weight of the evidence piling before the court. The judge struck his gavel again, silencing the noise. His voice carried authority, final and unyielding. Enough. The court will hear the letter. Every head turned, every breath stilled. The judge lifted the evidence letter, the one that bore the truth the patriarch had spent a lifetime burying. His voice was steady as he declared, "This document will be read aloud before the court. Gold cannot protect lies when truth shines brighter." The words of the judge echoed through the federal high court like a bell tolling for the dead. The letter, read aloud in measured tones, had sliced through decades of silence. It spoke of an illegitimate son, a boy denied his inheritance, a family's fortune manipulated to bury a child and silence a mother. Every line was a blade, every revelation a hammer striking cracks into the dynasty's marble facade, and when the reading ended, the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The very next morning, the EFCC moved in full force. Black vans and stern-faced officers poured into the Adedayo estates across Lagos, their jackets marked boldly, their presence inescapable. Gates that once opened for convoys of politicians now swung wide for investigators carrying warrants. Bank accounts that once overflowed were drained into frozen silence, credit cards declined, business operations halted. On television screens, Nigerians watched in astonishment as officers posted red stickers on mansion gates. Sealed. Properties were not just frozen, they were prepared for auction. Notices appeared in newspapers announcing the sale of estates in Ikoyi and Victoria Island, fleets of cars, and even the patriarch's prized yacht moored on the lagoon. The wealth that once defined his family was now itemized, cataloged, and stripped away piece by piece. Allies who had clung to him like moths to a flame now fled in broad daylight. Politicians who once called him brother held press conferences declaring their ignorance of his sins. "We cannot condone such behavior," said a governor who had toasted the patriarch just months earlier. "We stand firmly for transparency and accountability." Business partners quietly shredded contracts, distancing themselves as though his name itself carried contagion. The dynasty that had once been a fortress of influence now stood deserted, its walls abandoned by all who once sought shelter within. Inside the courtroom, the collapse played out in real time. The patriarch's lawyers shouted themselves hoarse, filing motion after motion, insisting the evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable. But each new revelation from the EFCC punctured their defenses. A property in Port Harcourt linked to the erased son. A transfer traced back to an account, hidden under a false identity. A string of shell companies folding into one undeniable truth: the empire had been built on lies. Toby sat in the gallery, his face pale, his hands gripping the bench so tightly his knuckles whitened. Each revelation cut him deeper than the last. The man he had idolized, the man whose approval he had craved, now stood exposed as a fraud. His chest ached with humiliation, his pride shattered before the city that had once envied him. When recess was called, he rose and walked slowly to where his father sat hunched with his lawyers. The patriarch looked up, his eyes hollow, his lips trembling as though reaching for words of reassurance. But Toby's gaze was ice. "I am done," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will not carry your shame." He turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving his father behind. The cameras followed him, recording the heir abandoning the patriarch in the hour of his greatest need. The image became a headline before evening. "Son walks out, dynasty shattered." The patriarch raged in despair. In the privacy of his cell-like holding room, he threw his cane against the wall, the golden tip splintering. He screamed at his lawyers, cursed his enemies, cursed his own blood. His roar carried through the corridor, startling guards, but there was no strength left in it. It was not the bellow of a lion, but the cry of a wounded beast cornered by hunters. The second week of trial brought the inevitable. The EFCC presented its final arguments, weaving a tapestry of evidence so tight it left no gaps. The prosecution's voice rang with conviction. This is not merely about one family. This is about the abuse of power, the silencing of truth, and the arrogance that believes wealth can bury justice. No man is above the law, not even a chief. The judge's gavel struck. The verdict was read aloud, each word a nail in the coffin of a dynasty. The patriarch was found guilty of fraud, concealment, and inheritance manipulation. His properties were to be seized, his accounts forfeited, his influence dismantled. And in one final humiliation, the court stripped him of all honorary titles, the distinctions he had paraded as armor. He was no longer Chief Olabode Adedayo. He was a man named only by his sins. He staggered as the words sank in. His body swayed. His hand groped for the cane that was no longer there. The courtroom gasped as his face drained of color, his chest heaved, and his legs buckled. As the gavel struck for the last time, the patriarch collapsed to the floor, the echo of his fall louder than the judge's words, his empire reduced to dust in a single moment of judgment. When the mighty fall, the ground remembers the tremor. The gavel's echo lingered long after the patriarch collapsed. For days, newspapers replayed the footage, the once mighty Chief Olabode Adedayo crumpling in the courtroom, stripped of his titles, his empire dissolved before the eyes of a nation. Lagos, a city that thrived on spectacle, had never seen such a public undoing. The dynasty that had once stood as untouchable now existed only as a cautionary tale told in hushed voices. Outside the high court, crowds gathered daily, not to protest but to celebrate. Some had once been employees cheated of wages, others small business owners crushed under unfair contracts, still others ordinary citizens who had lived under the shadow of men like Olabode all their lives. They clapped, they sang, they carried placards that read, "No one is above the law." For the first time in years, justice did not feel like a rumor. It stood tall, undeniable, visible in the ruins of a billionaire's pride. The EFCC moved quickly, turning seizures into restitution. Funds frozen in offshore accounts were traced and returned. Properties auctioned were converted into compensation schemes for victims who had waited decades for redress. Men and women who had once been dismissed as nobodies now received letters, payments, acknowledgments that their struggles had not been forgotten. The very wealth that had silenced their cries now became the source of their healing. The patriarch himself faded from public view. Too weak to stand trial further, he was confined to a private medical facility under guard, a man reduced to whispers in the corridors of his own former kingdom. His name, once spoken with reverence, now carried only scorn. At parties where Lagos elites once boasted of their closeness to him, his name was met with silence. At boardrooms where his signature once carried contracts, his legacy was mentioned only as a warning. Amara, the bride who had whispered the word that cracked the empire, walked through the city not as a scandal, but as a symbol. Journalists followed her at first, cameras desperate to catch her every move, but she answered little, offering only dignity. Her whispered name had become legend, the spark of justice, the proof that truth, however faintly spoken, could reverberate louder than gold. She returned briefly to Nsukka, visiting her mother's grave, laying roses with quiet hands. Standing by the simple headstone, she whispered, "It's over, Mama. Your silence is no longer mine." In time, she began a new life, not one wrapped in pearls or guarded by convoys, but one marked by her own choices. She accepted a modest position at a legal advocacy group, helping women whose voices had been silenced by power. She carried scars of fear, of loss, of battles fought in shadows, but she carried them with pride. She had not been destroyed by the dynasty. She had been transformed into its undoing. Toby, the groom once meant to inherit an empire, walked another road. He left Lagos for a time, retreating from the glare of scandal. The weight of betrayal from his father and the humiliation of a public unraveling nearly broke him. But slowly, piece by piece, he rebuilt. He worked quietly with partners who valued honesty over power, investing not in oil or politics, but in technology startups, in clean energy ventures, in dreams untainted by shadows. He was no longer heir to a fraudulent throne, but a man carving his own legacy from the rubble. Broken, yes, but free. In their separate ways, both Amara and Toby carried the same lesson. Truth is heavier than gold, but it frees souls. For Amara, it freed her from the silence of her mother's pain. For Toby, it freed him from the chains of a father's lies. And for Lagos, it freed the city from the illusion that power could smother justice forever. Still, even as the dust settled, the ground remembered the tremor. Markets trembled, elites whispered, dynasties recalculated their silence. The fall of the Adedayos was a warning to every family that had built castles on buried sins. Some swore they would cleanse their ledgers, others only dug their holes deeper. But no one could deny the truth. If even Olabodi could fall, then no fortress was eternal. One evening, months after the trial, Amara sat at her modest desk, penning letters for the advocacy group. The city outside her window hummed with its usual chorus, honking cars, distant laughter, the thrum of generators. She was at peace, her life quiet, but her heart unshackled. Then came a knock at the door. She opened it to find no one there, only a small envelope lying on the mat, its cream paper almost identical to the one that had once summoned her to court. Her breath caught as she bent to pick it up. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the note inside. The message was short, written in hurried script, but it froze her blood all the same. The story isn't over. Another secret remains. Amara stared at the note, her heart pounding. Somewhere in the city, beyond the ruins of the Adedayo dynasty, another truth waited to be unearthed. If this story gripped you, don't let it end here. Your support keeps these powerful tales alive. Hit the like button if you believe truth always finds a way, and share this video so more people can witness how even the mighty can fall. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next emotional, shocking story. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were the bride holding that secret?